Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We start our technical sessions. In the first time slot, we will have a professor from Johns Hopkins University, Thomas Reid. He's going to speak about the attribution of cyber attacks.
Hello. Hi, my name is Thomas Reid. I think people are still coming in. I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins University in Washington, and I will today talk about a framework for attributing computer network intrusions, for a framework for finding out who is behind a specific computer network intrusion. I will briefly go through, open with a historical case, and then quickly walk you through this model. And I'll do that quite quickly so that we have time for a little bit of interaction in about 15 to 20 minutes. So very quickly, the question of who was behind a specific incident, obviously, is a very old question. This is not a new problem connected to computer network intrusions and cybersecurity. A case study that I would like to mention, sorry for this, is a German one. I'm actually a German citizen myself. So here's an interesting historical case study where this is the former Chancellor of Germany. Some of you may recognize him, Helmut Kohl, on the phone. And he was on the phone with this person, his party secretary. His name was Kurt Biedenkopf. This is in the 1970s, the year, very close to the year I was born in, about 1975. And they were talking, they were fighting, they had a conflict, they were disagreeing about some leadership situation within the Christian Democratic Party. And on the phone was also the Ministry of State Security from East Germany, Stasi, was listening in. This is from archival sources. And on the phone, they were recording the transcript. This is Stasi that was recording the transcript. And because they were fighting with each other, Stasi thought, this is pretty good material. We can make this public and embarrass the Christian Democrats in West Germany. So what they did next is they gave the material to a German newspaper, to Der Stern, and Der Stern published it and caused a political scandal in Germany. And what's interesting about it is the East German Ministry of State Security gave the transcript to the German journalist in West Germany, pretending to be an American intelligence agency. And you can see here the form that they gave them, and it says agent report at the top, and this is the actual original form, an American form from the archives. So they were pretending to be somebody else. This is a nice historical case study to show that there's a long history of countries pretending to be somebody else in this case. There is also an attribution problem that can be solved forensically. I will not use any more examples and instead talk about the framework of attribution. The debate in cybersecurity about attribution has evolved, has moved on quickly over the past few years. So we had for a long time three assumptions that dominated the conversation. First, that attribution is a technical problem. Second, that attribution is a binary problem, that you can either attribute or you cannot attribute. And thirdly, that the evidence matters most. That the main challenge is finding the forensic artifacts and the forensic evidence, not what you then do with it, or not how you communicate it, for example. So the questions that I want to briefly address today is, first, if attribution is not just technical, what is it instead? If it's not just black and white, how is high quality attribution different from low quality attribution? And if it's not just about evidence, what is it then, what else matters? So the arguments that I want to give you today is that attribution is really an art as much as it is a science. It's nothing you can automate because computer network intrusions evolve, and so the art of finding them has to evolve as well. It's a cat and mouse game. On an operational level, attribution is a process. It's nothing that happens quickly. It requires cooperation among sometimes different organizations for a long period of time. And finally, attribution is ultimately, on a strategic level, is a result of the political significance of a specific case. If something is very politically significant, then it will be possible to get to the bottom of it by investing time, resources, and personnel. In order to come to terms with how attribution is done in practice, and it has happened, obviously, in the context of computer network intrusions for more than 2 decades, we developed this model, the Q model. Don't be shocked now. I won't go through the whole thing with you, only a few highlights. I think it's really important to begin with to understand, can I point with this? Yeah, well, to understand that there are different layers. There's a strategic layer, an operational layer, and a technical layer. And some of you who work in large organizations, perhaps in a large bank or a large corporation, you will understand that often there's a language problem because the people who do the technical work express themselves in a language that people at the top, CEOs, executives, don't really understand. So part of attribution is really to manage the language issues within organizations. Here, by language, I mean jargon. So in the technical, among technical people, there's a term that's widely used, and that's indicators of compromise, often abbreviated to IOCs. Can I just ask you who in this room is using the term IOC in their normal work? Is that something that you are familiar with? Okay, a few technical people in the room. So you will understand what this is. An IOC can be an IP address. It can be a specific hash that you generate out of malware that you identify or something. Those of you who understand what IOCs are will also understand that it's difficult to communicate the significance of IOCs to people higher up in the organization. So that's why we came up with this model, because sometimes it's important that people who are technical get the right tough questions. If you don't understand what kind of questions to ask to the technical people in your organization, then it's easy for the technical people to essentially just say something and you don't know how to respond, and the quality of the output as a result will remain lower. On a technical level, what is important, for example, is the type of targeting. Imagine, again, you're in a large organization, and the targeting could mean somebody is specifically looking for the computer of the CEO, and then specifically looking for particular emails on that computer about an upcoming merger and acquisition deal, for example. If you have that kind of information about the targeting, it can be very revealing to find out who was behind the intrusion. Another aspect is language artifacts. So, for example, if you look at the malware itself, at the binaries, it is sometimes possible that in the binaries and the technical piece of software that is doing the damage or taking out information, that there are comments in the code like comments that are written into the code in order to explain to the other developers what is going on. And there are many examples of language artifacts in binaries, for example, Mandarin or Farsi language artifacts in binaries. And that can be an interesting artifact. Well, of course, it can also be faked, just like in the Stasi example that I mentioned. But that's why attribution is an art. If you look at the whole picture, and if you look at all the mistakes that an intruder made, and then it will become clear whether something is a mistake or a forgery. Well, not always, but often it will become clear when you look at the whole picture. Complex attacks, complex intrusions have a pattern of life. This is a term from intelligence analysis. Patterns of life, so intrusions obviously don't happen at light speed. They happen over months, over weeks and months and sometimes years. And you can observe certain patterns of behavior. Time, in terms of time zones, in terms of operational tradecraft on display. And of course that can be very revealing about an adversary, especially if you watch a criminal, for example, or a known adversary over a very long period of time. I will briefly move up sort of the operational level, just to give you a few questions that investigators would ask on that level. One interesting question is the skills. Not all computer intrusions are created equal. I think some other panelists have mentioned this earlier, that some attacks are very complex, require skills that are very rare, especially if we look at critical infrastructure systems that are often complex systems, not widely publicly known, that requires a specific skill set, sometimes also knowledge that is not publicly available. So for example, sometimes based on the skills and on display, based on the type of knowledge on display, it will be possible to see whether maybe an insider was behind a specific leak or attack or whatever it was. And finally, often the context really matters. Sometimes it is possible to correlate computer network intrusions with political events. And then it will become, you have an additional, or not just political events, but also commercial events, like a merger and acquisition. So sometimes intrusion activity goes up ahead of a major economic business event for a company, and so that can also be highly useful. And you will already see here that the people in an organization who do the forensic analysis with malware, reverse engineering, they don't usually know a lot about the wider context of an event. So that is why attribution is a team sport. You can't do it alone, obviously. It requires cooperation. Which leads me to the strategic level. The who is responsible for ordering an intrusion. I shouldn't have used the word attack here, but often we're looking at intrusions that are not attacks, only to gain information. These are the hardest questions, and sometimes it is impossible to make a conclusion, to infer from the technical to the strategic level. So there will be situations where you simply cannot answer that question. Who was behind something, simply because whoever was it was just paying very careful attention. So the example that I had earlier from the Stasi operation in the 70s, we only know about this operation because we can confirm it and tell the full story based on Stasi interviews and Stasi archive files, 20 years later. Sometimes it takes a very long time for the truth to come out. I want to, before I end with this brief overview, I just would like to mention the problem of communicating attribution. So, for example, when the FBI in the United States communicated their finding that they found North Korean operators in the Sony entertainment networks, that they didn't do a very professional job doing this the first time. The communication didn't actually really work. They provoked a lot of criticism, and people didn't really believe what the FBI had to say. So the question of what kind of details to release to the public and to other countries in order to make an attribution claim, that is a very, very difficult question, because sometimes sources are sensitive and you cannot reveal a lot of detail. But I would just say that this is where the process gets political and gets very sensitive. And but I think we learned over the past few years that revealing the right details makes all the difference in a case. And just one example, the New York Times story was mentioned a few times already in this conference from a few days ago that claimed there were implants in the Russian electricity grid. There were absolutely no details whatsoever in that story. It was just a very abstract claim. And I am I'd like to technically inform my analysis and be solid in my assessment. So I am not putting any stock, I don't believe that this article is correct at this stage, because there are other reasons why I believe that, but here, let me just say that because this is a complicated process, a lot of the press coverage that we see coming, even out of very good newspapers, like the New York Times, can be bad and even completely wrong. So I would just encourage all of you to apply a sound technical analysis and don't just believe what's written about these situations in the news. Sometimes, obviously, they get it right. Sometimes they don't. So I'll conclude. Again, attribution is what countries, what states and governments make of it, because it really often, for the most complex cases, it requires government-level capabilities to attribute. Sometimes it doesn't. Some cases can be attributed by the private sector as well. So I would call into question these 5 assumptions. Offenders can hide behind attribution. I don't think that's correct. The internet empowers the weak, a widely held assumption. Here again, we have to question this. The most wired and connected countries are the most vulnerable countries. I would also be very careful with this assumption. The internet favors the offense, not the defense. And finally, facts matter most. These are wrong, so I just want to make that very clear. These assumptions are either completely or partly misguided. Instead, I think we should make these assumptions. Attribution has long been happening. Only governments can really widen the aperture of a complex case and open up the perspective. Capabilities are a function of a number of things, but mostly resources, investment in resources and talent of analysts and people working the case. Finally, one mistake can undo and reveal an intruder. Sometimes we have multiple mistakes to work with, but just one mistake can be enough. So that doesn't favor the weak, really, because the weak tend to make a lot of mistakes. And finally, it's not just facts that matter, but also credibility. So if you have a company, for example, there are some companies, or indeed some journalists, that I know in their past have done extremely careful work, very high level of credibility. They admit mistakes, for example, that I trust. So that kind of credibility is an extremely important asset in this conversation. Some companies, some journalists have very low levels of credibility. Finally, I would sum up that attribution and the quality of attribution is a function of resources, of time, and of how good the entity is that you're trying to catch. I think we have 10 minutes for questions and answers, and I would be happy to try to answer any questions that you may have. I think there's translation available for me. I apologize, I do not speak Russian, but you can ask your question in Russian and I will be able to understand. Yes, sir.
Dmitry Pravikov, Russian State University of Oil and Gas. So in the United States, a year ago, they adopted a Cloud Act. So what do you think, what level of evidence this law can provide, of proof?
Sorry, I'm hearing myself here. Let's switch that off. I don't think I understood the question. Yeah, sorry. 5. Yeah, I have it. I understood the question. I was just speaking, and I don't think a law as such can necessarily provide any specific level of evidence. So I think the level of evidence and credibility is always case dependent, and if you have, you know, a government agency, the FBI, or a specific company publishing a report about a specific case, that is what I would assess in terms of the evidence. But a law as such is only a framework, and I'm not sure I can answer your question competently. Is that helpful? Do you want me to say more? Sorry, I don't. We can continue the conversation offline if you like. Are there any other questions that I could potentially help to? I know this is a very complex field, attribution, this entire process. This project that I developed, that we developed, this is teamwork, was partly funded by the UK government. I was working in London when I finished this. I only moved to the United States relatively recently. The European countries also, and the United States, have begun to develop a conceptual framework for attribution, have begun to try to come to terms with how to communicate these cases internationally, and have started to be more public in 2017. Especially the UK is, I think, leading there. But I know that Germany, for example, is thinking about these problems as well. And I once presented this work also in Beijing at a government workshop on this conversation. And I know that China also has, you know, a significant attribution challenge because China obviously is also at the receiving end of a number of high-level operations. But also China has this unique situation that a lot of Chinese companies are hacking other Chinese companies. So the Chinese government has a challenge in terms of understanding what is going on there. Please. Will you ask in Russian? No. Okay.
Hello, thank you for your report. And my question is, will you plan make some framework, real framework, such as a place when people can write answers from your model?
Yeah.
This one place, and incident happened, and they write answers and look at the situation in one place, such as real framework, not framework ask, not model, real framework.
So we published an article in a peer-reviewed scholarly journal about this model, it's a long article that includes a detailed graphic and discussion. We also did case study work and applied this to specific cases, and that's partly published as well. Is that, if I understand your question correctly, is that what you were asking? But I would just also add, you know, this can be, if you work on attribution as a scholar, it can be sometimes a quite frustrating thing if you read the public conversation, if you follow the public conversation about it. Because in the space of just a few years, we went from attribution is impossible to attribution is easy. And a lot of journalists, a lot of people jump to conclusions very quickly today. That is true, I think, in different countries. It's also true in the United States. It's not easy to do attribution. It's sometimes possible. Actually, sometimes it is easy. But often it is hard. And in some cases, it may be close to impossible. It depends. We can't say in general terms. So that is why facts and evidence and artifacts, forensic artifacts, matter so much. Whatever we do, if we come to a conclusion that something happened or that something didn't happen, we just need to back it up with some facts. And what I find frustrating, and this is why I did this framework, is people who dismiss evidence completely, which happens again and again. Some of this evidence, think about it this way. In criminal investigations, if there's somebody who breaks into a house or somebody gets killed, or even if there's a car accident, in like real life situations, we have widely understood law enforcement investigations and forensic techniques that we have accepted. And our legal system has evolved and criminal justice system has evolved to understand, to deal with this evidence. But in the digital space, in the space of computer intrusions, we don't have the intuitions yet. We don't have the sort of the instincts about the quality of the evidence yet. And this is an attempt to build this sort of consensus about what is good evidence and what is not good evidence. Do we have any other questions? Yes, please, sir. Yeah, right here and then in the back. Maybe you go first.
Можно, да? На русском.
So, according to your opinion, attribution, I think it is too generalized and too universal in your prospect. Don't you think that in some specific spheres it might be useless?
I'll take you as well, because I have only 2 minutes left. And the third person there in just a moment.
Hi, Thomas. Thanks for your presentation. My question is pretty simple. I'm from the bank. Can you give an example of appliance of your model to any information security incident in the bank? Imagine one and apply it.
In the bank?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, yeah. Yes.
Вопрос такой.
Question, you are talking about attribution and a certain standard framework. You presented a model, and how do you think this framework will work at the national legislation level? Well, roughly speaking, if there is an incident in one country which occurred there, and you were sued from another, it might happen that your model will not be applicable, but we have to do something about it.
Yeah. I'll take those questions in reverse order. So the first question about the international legal situation in these cases is an extremely difficult question. We don't have good answers yet. This is an ongoing problem. There's one, there are currently cases, major cases in legislation that will, so you may have heard of the NotPetya incident, which affected companies in Russia, but also in the West, and especially in Ukraine, in Europe, in the United States. Some of these companies filed for insurance to get money back. And there's one insurer, I will not mention any companies here, who has refused to pay the money. And now this case is going to court, and the money in question is 100 million, so it's a lot of money. And the question of the attribution, the question of the evidence here, is at the heart of this legal battle. So this is an interesting legal case to watch. It is happening in Chicago, in Illinois. The question about the bank example, an example, how can this model be applied? I think we'd really have to, any complex intrusion that involves, a bank, a large company, will involve multiple layers. So I would hope that somebody at the top can read this article, understand the model, and then ask better questions to the people at the bottom of the organization. That's kind of what it's designed to do. But also for technical people to understand the strategic questions. Now I'm getting a very aggressive stamp here that says time is over. I need to stop. I will stop. And how about I answer your question off stage? Thank you very much.